What were Hitler's biggest mistakes that cost him the war? What would you do if the world you built, brick by brick, lie by lie, was crumbling just above your head? Nearly 30 feet beneath the war-torn streets of Berlin, in a bunker swallowed by fear and fading power, Adolf Hitler faces the bitter end of a war he unleashed. The walls tremble as Soviet tanks roll in and Red Army troops tighten their grip on the city. Outside, Berlin burns. Inside, the man who once commanded nations is unraveling, detached from reality, drowning in paranoia. As chaos consumes the city and defeat becomes undeniable, Hitler sees only one escape, and it's not surrender. What drives a leader to choose death over capture? The rise of fascism. In Germany, after the First World War. After the end of the First World War in 1918, few could have imagined that another devastating conflict would soon engulf the world. The immense loss of life, the widespread destruction of cities and infrastructure, and the deep economic scars left by the 4-year war were thought to be enough to deter any future military confrontations. Soldiers returned home to applause and national pride, celebrated as heroes after years away from their families. The signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 marked the beginning of what many believed would be a new era of peace, and millions around the globe rejoiced at what was then called the war to end all wars. However, this hope for lasting peace began to fade in the 1930s with the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in Germany. On January 30th, 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany as part of a coalition government in which the Nazis initially held only 3 cabinet positions. Contrary to popular belief, Hitler did not come to power with absolute control. His early days in office were marked by political uncertainty and a cautious awareness of public opinion. To secure his position, Hitler adopted a dual strategy, passing legislation that gradually expanded his authority and capitalizing on major events to justify emergency powers. One of the key turning points came with the Reichstag fire. The German parliament building was set ablaze under mysterious circumstances. While there was no definitive proof that the Nazis orchestrated the fire, they wasted no time in using it to accuse the communists of plotting against the state. This narrative allowed Hitler to push for the Reichstag fire decree, granting him emergency powers to suppress opposition. Shortly after, he maneuvered the passage of the Enabling Act, which permitted him to enact laws without parliamentary consent, effectively sidelining the democratic system and consolidating his rule. The Nazi regime quickly targeted left-wing parties, including the Social Democrats and Communists, banning them entirely. Over time, all other political parties were dissolved or banned, leaving the Nazi Party as the only legal political entity in Germany. Thus, a one-party totalitarian state was born. At the time, the role of Chancellor was not the highest position in the German state. This title belonged to the president. However, when President Paul von Hindenburg died, Hitler took advantage of the moment to merge both positions, proclaiming himself Führer, or leader. This term carried strong fascist connotations and signaled the complete transformation of Germany's political structure. Under Hitler's leadership, democratic institutions were dismantled, opposition silenced, and propaganda used to manipulate public opinion. Hitler declared that the German people had chosen this path through legal and democratic means, but it was, in truth, a calculated deception. The German population, unaware of the horrors that lay ahead, gradually placed their faith in Hitler, swayed by his promises of national revival and strength. What followed was a regime of oppression, war, and genocide that would plunge the world into an even greater catastrophe. The rise of Hitler's expansionist ambitions, Europe on the brink of war. By 1938, Adolf Hitler's intentions for Germany were no longer concealed in vague political rhetoric. They were evident in his bold actions and unwavering resolve. Hitler was not merely seeking to restore Germany's pride after the humiliating Treaty of Versailles. He was determined to reshape Europe entirely. His ambition was nothing short of the creation of a new German empire, one that he envisioned rivaling the might and grandeur of ancient Rome. Central to Hitler's foreign policy was an aggressive, expansionist doctrine rooted in the belief of Macht über Moral, power over morality. For Hitler, military strength and territorial acquisition took precedence over diplomacy, rationality, or peace. In his worldview, international agreements and collective security pacts were hindrances to Germany's rightful destiny. This belief directly conflicted with the aims of the League of Nations, which had been established after World War I to promote peace and safeguard global stability. Unsurprisingly, Hitler withdrew Germany from the League, freeing himself to pursue his expansionist goals unimpeded. This path of conquest began with bold steps. In 1936, Hitler marched German troops into the Rhineland, violating the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno Pact. The world watched, but no one stopped him. Emboldened, he turned to Austria, a German-speaking nation he believed rightfully belonged to the Reich. Through intimidation and manipulation, Hitler orchestrated the Anschluss in 1938, the unification of Austria with Nazi Germany. But Hitler's hunger for land and power did not end there. His eyes turned toward Czechoslovakia, particularly the Sudetenland, a region with a significant ethnic German population. Claiming the right to protect these Germans, Hitler demanded its annexation. The international community, desperate to avoid another catastrophic war, chose appeasement. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain famously declared peace for our time after the Munich Agreement allowed Hitler to take the Sudetenland. Yet Hitler's ambitions were far from satisfied. Behind the scenes, Hitler was also contemplating the conquest of Poland and other eastern territories, envisioning Lebensraum, living space, for the German people. His calculated steps were not reckless impulses. They were part of a grand strategy to dominate Europe. In Britain, the fear of another war loomed large. Gas masks were distributed to civilians, and children were evacuated from major cities like London in anticipation of bombings. Though conflict had not yet officially begun, the continent was teetering on the edge. By 1938, Hitler had made it clear. He would stop at nothing. Diplomacy had failed, treaties were meaningless, and the world stood at the threshold of a new and devastating conflict. Through the dawn of devastation, how Europe slipped into war. In the hush of late summer 1939, as Europe exhaled a fragile breath of peace, few could sense the storm about to break. Behind closed doors, in a chilling dance of diplomacy and deception, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin forged a pact that would shock the world. This agreement, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, was more than a mere promise of non-aggression between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. It was a secret handshake, sealing the fate of Poland and laying the groundwork for the most destructive war humanity had ever seen. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler unleashed the might of the Wehrmacht upon Poland. But what many forget is that just 16 days later, Stalin, too, sent his Red Army crashing across Poland's eastern border. This was no coincidence. It was the fulfillment of their secret deal to divide and conquer. Hitler had needed absolute assurance that Stalin would not interfere, and the pact had delivered just that. With Stalin's silent consent, Hitler could now unleash his blitzkrieg, literally lightning war, with terrifying speed and precision. Germany's invasion of Poland wasn't just fast, it was revolutionary. Never before had the world seen war like this. Coordinated strikes from the Luftwaffe rained terror from above, while tank divisions tore through Polish defenses on the ground. The Polish resistance, courageous though it was, could not withstand the sheer scale and speed of the attack. It wasn't weakness, but the weight of overwhelming force that crushed them. Poland was caught in the jaws of two beasts, one from the west, one from the east, and it stood little chance. Back in Britain, the mood was somber yet resolute. Though the wounds of the First World War still haunted the national memory, a line had been crossed. Britain and France had both promised to protect Poland in the event of an attack. And so, on the morning of September 3rd, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain made a solemn radio address to the nation. Hitler had failed to respond to the ultimatum, demanding a withdrawal from Poland. As the clocks struck 11, Britain was once again at war with Germany. The German people, deeply enamored with Hitler's charisma and the illusion of restored national pride, did not rejoice at the thought of war, but they followed. Such was the power of propaganda and the spell Hitler had cast over the nation. In a matter of days, the world shifted, peace shattered. And so began the most harrowing chapter of modern history as World War II unfolded in blood and fire across the continent. Cha. The final descent. Whispers beneath Berlin. As the cold breath of January swept across war-torn Europe in 1945, a quiet but undeniable truth began to settle over the heart of Nazi Germany. The empire that once seemed unstoppable was beginning its final descent into darkness. Far from the roar of the front lines, beneath the shattered skyline of Berlin, Adolf Hitler withdrew into the shadows, into the Führer bunker, a claustrophobic warren buried deep beneath the Reich Chancellery. It was here, in this subterranean tomb of crumbling dreams and fading delusions, that the last chapter of the Third Reich would begin to unfold. This bunker, reinforced with thick concrete walls and filtered air, was meant to be an indestructible command center. But now, it served more as a prison, one that contained not only bodies, but the unraveling psyches of its occupants. Outside, Allied forces pressed in from both east and west. The Red Army, fierce and unrelenting, was closing in from the direction of Poland, while American and British forces advanced with equal determination from France. Nazi Germany, stretched thin across too many fronts, could no longer hold. Inside the Führer bunker, however, a different reality was being staged. Despite the looming collapse, Hitler and his inner circle clung to illusions of victory. Maps were studied with hope rather than strategy, and meetings were held with empty bravado. It was a theater of denial, an eerie calm before the inevitable storm. The architect of war was now a captive of his own fantasies, and the end he had long feared was already knocking on the bunker's steel doors. Cut. 5. A world on the brink, the calm before the storm. In September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany after Adolf Hitler invaded Poland. People across Europe braced themselves for chaos, expecting battles to erupt quickly. But surprisingly, very little happened at first. For almost 8 months, from late 1939 to the spring of 1940, a strange and quiet period set in. It became known as the Phony War, a time when the world was technically at war, but real fighting seemed to be on hold. For many in Britain, this calm was confusing and frustrating. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, known for his cautious and diplomatic approach, had long tried to avoid conflict. Even after declaring war, he hesitated to launch attacks against Germany. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, Hitler wasn't sitting idle. His army was growing stronger and spreading rapidly, taking over countries like Norway, Denmark, and pushing deeper into Eastern Europe. While the Allies waited, Germany was on the move. Back in Britain, one politician was becoming more vocal than ever. Winston Churchill, who had been warning about Hitler for years, believed the country needed to act quickly and boldly. He didn't trust Hitler's intentions and saw the phony war as a dangerous delay. Churchill had been in and out of government roles during the 1930s, often criticized for being too aggressive or alarmist, but now his warnings were proving to be right. In May 1940, everything changed. Chamberlain, struggling with poor health and pressure from Parliament, stepped down as Prime Minister. Winston Churchill took his place. Almost immediately, he was thrown into a major crisis that would test his leadership like never before. Just days after Churchill became Prime Minister, the German army launched a lightning-fast invasion through Belgium and into France, a tactic known as blitzkrieg, or lightning war. The speed and power of the attack overwhelmed the Allied forces. Soon, hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers were trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, a small town in northern France. Surrounded by enemy troops and with no clear escape, their situation looked hopeless. At that moment, Britain faced a choice: accept a crushing defeat or attempt the impossible. What followed was one of the most dramatic and heroic episodes of the war: the Dunkirk evacuation. While German forces halted their advance for reasons still debated by historians, British civilians and the Navy raced to rescue the trapped soldiers. Fishing boats, pleasure yachts, lifeboats, nearly anything that could float, crossed the English Channel in a desperate effort to bring the men home. This rescue mission, and Churchill's powerful words of encouragement during it, would go on to unite the British people. It wasn't just about saving lives. It was about showing the world that Britain would stand strong, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The war was far from over, but the spirit of resistance had been awakened. 6. Hitler's final gamble, the turning tide of World War II. As World War II entered its final phases, Adolf Hitler, once the seemingly unstoppable Führer of Germany, found himself increasingly isolated in his Berlin bunker. His dreams of global domination were crumbling. His army, once feared across Europe, was now stretched thin and battered on multiple fronts. Outside the crumbling walls of his Reich, a formidable alliance had taken shape. An unprecedented coalition of Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. These three global powers met at Yalta, their aim no longer simply to win battles, but to shape the world after Hitler's defeat. Ironically, it was only a few years earlier that Stalin's Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany, a calculated move by both dictators to buy time and secure territorial ambitions. But that fragile agreement would shatter in 1941 with one of the boldest and ultimately most disastrous moves of the war. Operation Barbarossa. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched his invasion of the Soviet Union. More than 3 million German soldiers surged across the Eastern Front in what was meant to be a swift and decisive blow. Having already conquered France and much of Western Europe, Hitler believed a rapid blitzkrieg could bring the Soviet regime to its knees before the harsh Russian winter set in. Initially, the campaign appeared to be a spectacular success, as German forces pushed deep into Soviet territory, destroying everything in their path. But Stalin, underestimated by Hitler, responded not with collapse, but with calculated resilience. He ordered strategic retreats, absorbing losses while drawing German forces further into the vast Russian interior. While German tanks were meticulously engineered, they were complex and slow to produce. In contrast, the Soviets churned out simple, rugged equipment and quickly rebuilt their forces. What Hitler had intended as a knockout blow became a drawn-out war of attrition that drained German resources and morale. This turning point dramatically reshaped the alliances of the war. With the USSR now fully committed to the Allied cause, Winston Churchill reached out to Stalin, forging a powerful partnership built on necessity. Meanwhile, across the globe, a parallel conflict was intensifying. Japan, pursuing its imperial ambitions in Asia, had already alienated the United States by invading China. When the US halted oil exports to Japan, cutting off 80% of its supply, the Japanese leadership decided that war with America was inevitable. To gain the upper hand, they orchestrated a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The strike was devastating. In under an hour, the Japanese destroyed or disabled much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, killing over 2,400 Americans. President Roosevelt, with the full support of Congress, declared war the following day. As part of the Axis alliance, Germany and Italy responded by declaring war on the United States. This decision would prove catastrophic for Hitler. Britain's global empire, the Soviet Union's manpower, and the United States' industrial and financial might now stood united against the Nazi regime. Churchill, ever the strategist, saw America's entry into the war as the key to victory. He famously remarked that Hitler's fate was sealed. No longer could Germany rely on swift conquests or isolated campaigns. The Allies, coordinated and determined, began to reclaim territory across Europe and beyond. By early 1945, German cities were under siege from all directions. American forces crossed the Rhineland, Soviet troops surged westward, and Britain maintained relentless pressure from the air and sea. As Hitler remained entrenched in his bunker, his vision of a 1,000-year Reich dissolved into chaos and ruin. The decision to break the Soviet pact, the underestimation of American resolve, and his blind ideological hatred had cornered Germany into an unwinnable position. With every liberated town and every exposed atrocity of the Nazi regime, the world united not only in military effort, but in moral condemnation. In the end, Hitler had pitted himself against a world that now stood united, and that world was closing in. 7. The Battle of Berlin and the Shadow of Stalingrad, a pivotal turn in World War II. By April 16, 1945, Stalin's Red Army had reached the outskirts of Berlin, signaling the imminent collapse of Nazi Germany. Hitler's grip on power was weakening by the day as Soviet forces prepared for a final, decisive battle to seize the German capital. For many, the approaching confrontation revived haunting memories of Stalingrad, the bloodiest and most brutal battle on the Eastern Front. The last time Soviet and Nazi forces clashed over a major strategic city, the result was catastrophic. The Battle of Stalingrad, fought in southern Russia, symbolized the horrors of urban warfare and total war. With estimated casualties exceeding 1.5 million, including soldiers and civilians, the city became a graveyard of ambition and pride. Both Hitler and Stalin adopted a siege mindset, refusing to retreat or compromise, prolonging the suffering and destruction. Stalingrad was not just a military engagement, it was a relentless struggle of endurance and resolve. Fierce close-quarters combat raged across ruined buildings and rubble-strewn streets, while relentless German air raids devastated the civilian population. Conditions for both armies were abysmal. Freezing temperatures, dwindling supplies, and a constant threat of death made survival as difficult as victory. The Soviet triumph at Stalingrad proved to be the turning point of World War II. The crushing defeat forced the German High Command to divert troops and resources from other occupied territories in Europe to replenish their devastated Eastern Front. More significantly, the victory revitalized Soviet morale and shifted the balance of power, placing the Red Army firmly on the offensive and pushing Hitler's forces into retreat. Now, as the Red Army closed in on Berlin, the lessons and legacy of Stalingrad loomed large. It was a reminder of the cost of hubris, the brutality of urban warfare, and the resilience of a force determined not only to defend, but to liberate. The battle for Berlin would be the final chapter, but it was written in the blood of cities like Stalingrad. Al 8. The final days of Adolf Hitler, a descent into oblivion. As the cold winds of April 1945 swept through the smoldering ruins of Berlin, a sense of doom blanketed the city like a suffocating fog. Deep beneath the fractured streets, in the concrete depths of the Führerbunker, Adolf Hitler's final chapter unfolded, not with the grandeur of a conquering ruler, but with the unraveling mind of a defeated man. The once mighty leader, who had cast a shadow over Europe for more than a decade, now found himself surrounded. Physically, by the Soviet Red Army, and mentally by paranoia, despair, and irreversible defeat. The Red Army, relentless in its advance, pushed mercilessly into Berlin. Their mission was fueled by vengeance for the atrocities committed on Soviet soil, atrocities orchestrated by the Nazis. Hitler's illusion of invincibility dissolved. As shells pounded the city above, he remained in his underground lair, isolated from reality, sustained only by a cocktail of sedatives, stimulants, and fantasy. The final betrayal came from within. News reached Hitler that Heinrich Himmler, once one of his most loyal men, was attempting secret peace negotiations with the Allies. This perceived act of treason shattered what little remained of Hitler's trust. He ordered Himmler's arrest, but the SS leader had vanished. Hermann Fegelein, Himmler's representative in the bunker and the brother-in-law of Eva Braun, was found drunk and preparing to flee. Dragged back to the bunker, Fegelein was sentenced to death and executed, an ominous warning to all others. Soon after, word arrived of Benito Mussolini's grisly end at the hands of Italian partisans. For Hitler, this was a haunting omen. He vowed not to suffer the same public humiliation. Determined to control his own fate, he summoned his secretary Traudl Junge and dictated his final will and political testament. In it, he denied responsibility for the war, praised German loyalty, and insisted that he had chosen death over surrender. In a surreal turn, amidst the chaos and crumbling Reich, Hitler married his longtime companion Eva Braun in a quiet, joyless ceremony. The celebration that followed was half-hearted, more ritual than romance. The bunker had become a tomb in waiting. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler and Eva withdrew to their private quarters. With trembling hands, he handed her a cyanide capsule. Moments later, a gunshot echoed through the bunker. Hitler was dead, his body soon joined by Eva's. Their remains were burned in the ruined gardens above in a desperate attempt to keep them from Soviet hands. Only fragments, bones and teeth survived, later confirmed by dental records in Soviet archives. Despite lingering myths, Hitler did not escape. He died in Berlin, in the heart of the broken Reich he once ruled. The dictator's end, engulfed in flames and delusion, marked the collapse of a nightmare that had haunted the world. It began not with gunfire or glory, but with a suffocating silence deep beneath the scorched earth of Berlin. In the dim, claustrophobic confines of a concrete bunker, as the world above burned in the last spasms of a shattered Reich, the man who once commanded the loyalty of millions chose cowardice over justice. Adolf Hitler, the architect of genocide, chose to vanish by his own hand rather than face the tribunal of history. And he was not alone. Several of his inner circle followed suit, retreating into death rather than reckoning with the crimes they had unleashed upon the world. By late April 1945, the writing was etched in fire across the skies of Europe. The Red Army had reached the German capital, and Allied forces pressed from the west. The once mighty Nazi empire, built on blood and ideology, was crumbling rapidly. Hitler's delusions of a 1,000-year Reich had been reduced to days, then hours. Outside the bunker, cities lay in ruin and smoke. Inside, paranoia reigned. Whispers of betrayal and defeat echoed louder than the artillery. When Hitler's lifeless body was discovered on April 30th, it was not just the end of a man. It was the symbolic death of an ideology that had plunged humanity into darkness. But death did not absolve the crimes. The world would not be allowed to forget so easily. Just 1 week later, on May 7th, 1945, the official surrender of Germany was signed, and the guns finally fell silent across Europe. The war that had consumed a continent and claimed over 70 million lives was, at long last, over. Celebrations erupted across Allied nations, where joy was mingled with grief. The price of peace had been monumental, yet the victory was incomplete without understanding. As Allied troops advanced in the final months, they began to uncover the unimaginable: concentration camps, mass graves, and the machinery of genocide. The true horror of the Nazi regime emerged not through propaganda, but through the eyes of survivors and the silence of the dead. Germany, and indeed the world, stood at the edge of a moral abyss. How could such evil have thrived? How had ordinary citizens become complicit in such atrocities? The fall of the Reich was not just a military collapse. It was the beginning of a long and painful reckoning, one that would unfold in courtrooms, classrooms, and collective memory for generations to come.